So what happened is I wanted to leave, and they said, no, we want 100%. So we wait and stayed. We got 100%. Then we moved them all out of Syria, except we did keep the oil. You noticed that, right? We kept the oil. Sorry. They said he left soldiers in Syria. Yeah, I did, to keep the oil, if you don't mind, which is what we should have done in Iraq, too, by the way. I would have done that. They're making a lot of money with all that oil.
The United States still had compelling forms of leverage on the table to shape an outcome that was more conducive and protective of U.S. interests. And we identified 4. So the first one was the 1/3 of Syrian territory that was owned via the U.S. military with its local partner, the Syrian Democratic Forces. The first one was the 1/3 of Syrian territory that was owned via the U.S. military.
The first one was the 1/3 of Syrian territory that was owned via the U.S. military.
Now, this was a light footprint on the U.S. military, only about 1,000 troops over the course of the Syria Study Group's report, and then the tens of thousands of forces, both Kurdish and Arab, under the Syrian Democratic Forces. And that 1/3 of Syria is the resource-rich, it's the economic powerhouse of Syria. So where the hydrocarbons are, which obviously is very much in the public debate here in Washington these days, as well as the agricultural powerhouse. But we argued that it wasn't just about this 1/3 of Syrian territory that the U.S. military and our military presence owned, both to fight ISIS and also as leverage for affecting the overall political process for the broader Syrian conflict. There were 3 other areas of leverage. One is political and diplomatic isolation of the Assad regime, so holding the line on diplomatic isolation, preventing embassies from going back into Damascus. 2 is the economic sanctions architecture. So some of this is part of the maximum pressure campaign of the Trump administration on Iran, but there's a whole suite of both executive and congressional sanctions on Syria and Bashar al-Assad, both for human rights abuses in Syria and to the backers of Assad for their activities in support of him in Syria. And 3 was reconstruction aid. So the United States remains the overall largest single donor of humanitarian aid to Syrians both inside Syria and refugees outside of Syria. And there was some stabilization assistance in the part of Syria that was liberated from ISIS and controlled via the Syrian Democratic Forces in northern eastern Syria. The rest of Syria, though, is rubble. And what the Russians want and what Assad wants is economic reconstruction. And that is something that the United States can basically hold a card on via the international financial institutions and our cooperation with the Europeans. So we argued that absent behavioral changes by the Assad regime, we should hold the line on preventing reconstruction aid and technical expertise from going back into Syria.
Syria, we took them all out other than we kept the oil, if that's okay with you. We kept the oil. We have some back and keeping the oil. We should have kept the oil in Iraq, too. Remember, I used to say, keep the oil, don't go in. I'd say, don't go into Iraq, but I was a civilian. Nobody cared. I was like you, so nobody cared. President Erdogan wants to come to the White House. We have a very good relationship. The ceasefire has held very nicely. We've kept the oil. We stayed back and kept the oil. Other people can patrol the border of Syria, frankly, and Turkey. Let them. They've been fighting for 1,000 years. Let them do the border. We don't want to do that. We want to bring our soldiers home. But we did leave soldiers because we're keeping the oil. I like oil. We're keeping the oil, and we're working with the Kurds, and we're frankly working with Turkey. And we have total control of the oil. And frankly, we had a lot of support from a lot of different people. But right now, the only soldiers we have essentially in that area are the soldiers keeping the oil. So we have the oil, and we can do with the oil what we want.